So DeversiFi is a decentralized exchange which gives you the same benefits as a centralized exchange with very high speed, but trading from your own wallet. And we've been working on DAOs for a while. And so today I'm going to talk a bit about DAOs and DEXs and why they fit together, as I think various other projects are figuring out at the moment. And I'm going to start maybe slightly counterintuitively talking about the New York Stock Exchange, so the largest stock exchange in the world, and actually its own founding. So I don't know how many people here know the history of New York Stock Exchange, but actually it has a lot of relevance to DAOs and some parallels we can draw with what's happening with the formation of DAOs on Ethereum and other blockchains. And then I'm going to talk more about some of the experiments that are happening today, both that we've been doing and other projects in the space, and then talk about why we believe that a DAO will launch the largest exchange in the world and why it's better suited to do so than a company, and what we're doing next for our own launch. So to take you back to 1792, this is when New York Stock Exchange was first created. So the context was that we were in the US. It was very soon after the Revolutionary War. Essentially, the Brits had been kicked out. And at the time, there'd been a financial crisis. So for the first time, there was a huge amount of speculative trading going on, mainly on government-issued bonds, war bonds. But that led to kind of a first sort of bubble, and then a default, and lots of banks defaulted, so there was low confidence in markets at the time. And the primary way that people were trading these things were that they were using auctioneers who would charge all sorts of fees, and it was a very inefficient market. And also at the time, there had been previous stock exchanges, but all of these had been created by sort of existing establishment players, usually coalitions of banks. So for example, London Stock Exchange and Philadelphia Stock Exchange. And as a sort of solution to this, at the time, 24 relatively independent stockbrokers met in New York under this Buttonwood tree and signed an agreement. And they had, at the time, a very sort of simple purpose. Essentially, the 24 of them had a shared set of values, which is that they agreed that they would pledge themselves to each other to all uphold a minimum commission size when they traded with each other and anyone else, and that they would give preferential treatment to the other members of this informal club. And that was their agreement going forward, and that was where the New York Stock Exchange started off. More than 200 years later, New York Stock Exchange is now the largest in the world. It's on average $169 billion of trading volume, 3.1 trillion total assets under management, as in companies that are traded on New York Stock Exchange. So how did it get from that very humble beginning to where it is now? And just to bear in mind, the context of this, that actually the whole cryptocurrency markets is a very small proportion compared to the total amount of of companies capitalized on New York Stock Exchange. So from those 24 independent members, who are actually all essentially customers of the future exchange, it grew over the course of 200 years to eventually 1,366 members. And it was capped there in 1953 because that was becoming already unwieldy. It was very difficult to have an open, sort of relatively low structure organization with that many members. Oh yeah, thanks. So in 1864, there'd been, by that point it had grown semi-organically from 24 members to now closer to 550. And actually there were some rival organizations. There was the Open Board of Stock Exchanges in New York, which had another 350 members. So that was starting to compete with New York Stock Exchange. And actually the number of members is one of the biggest attractions for an exchange of any type. So the more members were part of it, the more people would route their orders through the platform, and the more likely other people would be to come and try and trade there because they'd know they'd get good prices when they tried to execute their orders. So there's a natural network effect associated with these, and it's very, very strong. And the fact there was another rival of a similar size caused them to merge together, actually, and end up creating an even larger organization, which facilitated it to continue growing. So why is this relevant to DAOs today? I think the first thing is that there are clearly a lot of parallels to the formation of a DAO to the way that New York Stock Exchange was created. So first of all, they had a very clear common purpose that they'd all agreed to, and it was very simple. And they all understood, despite the fact that in some ways they were competitors and in some ways that they were each doing different businesses, that they had those shared goals. And second of all, the fact that each of those initial sort of members who had sort of a stake in this, long-term would allow it to grow and incorporate others who shared their vision and who could help it become the most successful. And second of all, the network effects that were surrounding it were very clear. So the fact that the more members it had, that the better it could outcompete any other rivals. And so those that were formed instead by a small number of banks or financed by investors as opposed to future customers didn't do as well as the New York Stock Exchange. So the lessons we can start to draw from this are also quite clear for DAOs going ahead. So first of all, in this case, the membership numbers had to be kept limited. So it was impractical. And first of all, members had to all be in New York at the beginning because they couldn't communicate over long distances. But second of all, there were practical constraints to voting, for example. So one of the problems they had was once they were reaching more than 1,000 members, although they had a steering committee who would set the direction, every vote had to be ratified by the full membership. And particularly in the 1930s, as a lot of things were changing for securities trading with the Securities Exchange Commission in the US, this meant that they were very slow, and actually they had to end up, in a lot of ways, changing the way they were governed as a reaction to that in order to survive. And because of those natural constraints placed on their membership size, it was also quite a closed-off system by the end. So if you wanted to get a seat, you had to buy it off an existing member. You couldn't just join as you might be able to in a modern DAO. So fast forward to today, there are a huge number of experiments going on with decentralized autonomous organizations, which are much more open and solve some of these problems around, which limited the New York Stock Exchange membership size. And clearly we have technologies for communication where we can have members across the globe and vastly expand the size of these networks if we have good ways of then coordinating and putting these decisions that are taken into kind of practice. So DAO clearly is one of the best examples of this and has a very similar vision of growing a very large organization. And Moloch and Aragon are also doing a lot of good experiments on these kind of things. But I think one of the biggest sort of changes now is over the mechanism of voting. So the fact that you can start to experiment with things like prediction markets and holographic consensus for taking decisions where you don't need every single member to participate in every single vote starts to really mean that if we were creating New York Stock Exchange today, we might be able to imagine an organization which had not 1,000 but 10,000 or even 100,000 members, and we can start to imagine what an exchange like that could look like. So that's where we started off around 2 years ago, first with Ethfinex, which is where we launched a centralized exchange, but with the vision of thinking how we could lay some groundwork to create that initial membership group. Because what we figured out, and I think what a lot of DAOs now are also seeing, is that how you choose your initial reputation distribution and how you choose your initial members is actually the hardest problem, and also what you have the most influence over the future of the DAO through. So we wanted to make sure that we could gather, similarly to the New York Stock Exchange, a large enough group of people who traded, who essentially would be customers of this exchange in that initial distribution. And so we created a token that would be earned by anyone trading on the platform. So it was never sold, but from day one on launch of that centralized exchange, anyone who placed a certain type of order and added liquidity into the exchange would earn this over time. And from that point, we started to do various experiments with governance, build both our own voting tools and try out others, and start to get engagement from these traders who actually, at the beginning, weren't too interested necessarily in governance. They wanted to trade, naturally. But they started to get engaged, and we ran a governance summit and various other processes, including around our token listing. And then towards the end of last year, we launched Ethfinex Trustless, which is now the DeversiFi platform for trading from your own wallet without having to trust the exchange that you're using, which is now our flagship product. And so the next step for us is from all of those members who have essentially now got a stake and a token in the platform, how do we convert and make the next jump to them actually governing and controlling the platform and the future of it? So to recap, basically, we had two very simple agreements which we made and which every trader and member signed up to when they started using it 2 years ago. The first was that membership would be earned rather than bought, so there was no barrier to entry. But every time you placed an order, you would slowly build up your membership, and this meant that it's a completely open system, and the people who will now be those initial founding members are potentially very valuable customers and are very, very strongly aligned with the vision of what we were trying to do and what DeversiFi will end up delivering. And second of all, that 50% of the fees that were collected over that period would go into a pot that would belong to those members. And that would give them the foundation they would need to launch whatever the future DAO would look like. So over those 2 years, we have essentially distributed 18 million of these Nectar tokens. And those were distributed in proportion to the trading volumes that people did. And today, there's about $17,000 Ether, which is $3.5 million roughly, collected for them, and 2,000 to 3,000 token holders who would be the members of the DAO on day one. So for our own governance experiments, we had two aims. First of all, we wanted to test out various different mechanisms and see what worked and make sure that they were aligned with the customers and users that we had. But the other thing was that we wanted to really make sure that we started to get some engagement from these traders, because it's one thing to say to them on kind of after 2 years, oh look, now you're in charge of this and you have a DAO and you can start to make decisions. But if they aren't ready to do so and don't understand what that means, then we wouldn't get much engagement. So we started off with a fully sort of centralized token listing process, and we thought this would be the highest value place to start to do these experiments, since it has such big impact over customers of the platform. So first of all, we were basically vetting tokens and then deciding when to add them, and that was completely centralized. The next step was to take that second part and make it be decided by these Next token holders through token voting. And we had a slight spin on that, which I'll go into later, and essentially used a form of prediction market. And then the next part was also to decentralize the first part, the vetting of quality projects. So the full process partnered with Kleros, which uses decentralized arbitration to help take decisions using a crowd of jurors. And essentially, it started off with us publishing a very simple list of about 20 points, which we wanted every token that would be listed to meet. So, for example, this said that a token must have a certain percentage of its supply circulating. The team who had issued it must have been transparent about how much founders were holding and what the rest of the distribution was during the initial sale, that it wasn't a security in certain jurisdictions. And we published this list, and any token could come along and claim that they met those criteria, and to do so, they had to place a stake. So, for example, they could put down $10,000 in Ether and say, we are sure that we meet these criteria. At that point, anyone can come along and also say, and submit evidence to say, no, for whatever reason you don't, or you do, and challenge that claim by also putting a stake up. That then triggered a decentralized kind of jury process where there was an evidence period where anyone could submit evidence either for or against, and then eventually a ruling to decide whether or not it should get that badge to say that it met the criteria. And finally, afterwards, we continued with the voting process. So as far as I know, no one's done quite this thorough an experiment. And of course, actually, there's a lot of economic value, either for or against a token if it does get listed on a platform like this. And so people were taking this very seriously, and we actually saw huge networks of almost decentralized law firms with official logos who were publishing evidence on both sides and spending hours making 10-page documents for or against the token. And so here's just an example of some of the tokens that went through this process and received the badge. And you can see, for example, here at this point, Grid Plus had been challenged. So this is a token which was part of consensus and actually was challenged on quite an interesting claim. So on our list, one of the criteria was that they'd had an independent security review done by an independent third party. And one of the jurors picked up that although they had had a security audit done, it had been done by consensus audits, which was in some sense maybe not an independent third party. And of course, this is something which was potentially picked up and stricter than we would have been ourselves or than any centralized organization would have done speaking with them. And we saw that many times, that actually the crowd was sometimes stricter on the rules than an organization would have been. So one of the most contentious, and then there were quite a few contentious cases, was this one, which was SpaceChain. So this actually went through 2 rounds of appeals. So initially it was challenged, and the requester, SpaceChain, was found that they should receive the badge. The challenger appealed it, and then they were found they shouldn't, and it was appealed again, and again they were found they shouldn't eventually receive that badge. And the evidence was pretty interesting. So, and there was a lot of it on both sides. You can see here there were almost 20 documents submitted, and it added up to around 400 pages of content of an analysis done on the token. And this is just a few screenshots of some of what was submitted, but there was a lot of kind of research and work that had gone into this. And one of the main claims hinged on the fact that on their website, they had said that there were 5.6 million lines of code on their GitHub. Now, for a developer, I think that's quite a big claim. And it was actually true, but it was because they'd forked a lot of projects to their GitHub. And the initial challenger built this up and said, although that on its own is not a big problem, that plus a pattern of behavior across their white paper and website adds up to a potential evidence that the team is not honest and are not fit and proper persons, which is one of the criteria on our listing process. And this then went back and forth, and actually one of the really interesting things on this case was that the team SpaceChain were predominantly Chinese, and they claimed a lot of the stuff was due to just purely translation errors, and so actually fixed many of these things, including, for example, another claim that was made against them, which was that they hadn't been transparent enough about their listing process, which the next day they published on their website and actually showed that it had been somewhere but just not obvious enough. So this really pushed them actually to make a lot of changes. So in a lot of sense, not just diligence, but also improving the quality of the project's transparency over time, which was really powerful to see from this sort of decentralized process. And at the end, they were found, although they didn't receive the badge because they hadn't been eligible when they'd submitted, that when they reapplied afterwards, they'd made enough changes during the process to improve their website and various other materials that they did receive the badge on a second attempt. So overall, I mean, this was really fascinating to see and quite difficult for us, obviously, that we no longer had control over that process. But overall, around 100 cases were decided through appeals, and a huge amount of sort of economic value went through this in terms of stakes and also rewarding the jurors. And then the following stage to that was where we then tested out prediction markets. So around 30 or 40 tokens received these badges, but then prioritizing which ones should be listed, we implemented a prediction market model. So everyone who held these Next tokens who were members received an exact same number of voting tokens at the start of a voting round, which were transferable separately. So essentially, these were voting rights, which you could send to someone else or even sell in the market. And if you voted for a particular token and it ended up being listed, you would get a share of the future trading fees on that project. So there was a feedback loop set up so that someone would want to go out and research these projects and vote for the ones which would generate the most future value for the exchange. Again, this was really interesting to see the impacts of. And the really amazing thing was that, of course, the people who held these tokens are themselves traders. And so initially, we weren't expecting huge engagement, and we hadn't seen huge engagement from them on previous voting experiments we'd done. But on this, we saw absolutely vast engagement. And I think overall, in our final round, after we'd made quite a few tweaks, nearly 70% of the tokens we used to vote on. And bearing in mind that actually the people who held these are not just random people who are really excited about governance. They are predominantly traders who are there to make money, and yet this got a massive engagement from them. And that for us was a kind of eureka moment that prediction markets were going to be the way for us to do governance on our future DAO, and has informed kind of the direction we've taken since then. So for us, the kind of next step is evolving from the hybrid centralized Ethfinex platform that we were to DeversiFi, which is taking forward our decentralized exchange product and adding all sorts of new features. So this will be particularly sort of leveraged margin trading, and also improving the range of offerings available to compare against centralized exchanges. And then also revamping now that Nectar token, which was initially just for distribution of membership to the future DAO holders, but adding all sorts of extra benefits, and launching this Nectar DAO to, from now on, govern and grow it from 2,000 to 3,000 members to that potential 100,000 members. So we're collaborating with DAOstack on this, and following very much the inspiration, I think, from DXDAO, for example, which has kind of shown, first of all, the model that can work in terms of governing an exchange, but pushing it forward by using this sort of 2 years of foundations on the reputation distribution to really now see how large we can grow and grow the exchange with a really focused group of initial members who really believe in this and are essentially customers of it themselves. So reputation will initially start by going to those who stake their Nectar tokens on day one, and we're hoping we're looking forward to working on this. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll just add one more thing, which is that we have an event tomorrow evening, thegovernancagames.com. I think it's close to sold out, but it's going to be a really interesting fishbowl panel style event. So please do come along. It's at the Games Science Center in Berlin.